So thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here. So I will talk to you a little bit about how we can prevent sudden cardiac death in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in children. And so I'll focus a little bit on how we actually prevent sudden cardiac death, but mainly talk about how we identify those individuals who are at risk of dying suddenly, and then talk a little bit about some of the really major knowledge gaps that still remain. So this is the condition that we're talking about. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, characterized by left ventricular hypertrophy morphologically, and histologically by myocyte disarray, fibrosis, microvascular disease. And all of these features together really conspire to cause, or at least act as a trigger for sudden cardiac death, or ventricular arrhythmias, and therefore sudden cardiac death. And so in a way, it's not surprising, actually, that people and children with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy die suddenly. But actually, you'd expect a lot more people with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy to die suddenly, given the substrate that we're talking about. And there are certainly early studies that did suggest that the morbidity and certainly the mortality of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in childhood was very, very high. So these are data from a population-based study in Sweden, where they reported sudden cardiac death rates of up to 10% per year in some subgroups of patients. So really very, very high. More recent population-based studies, so the North American Pediatric Cardiomyopathy Registry, for example, our own UK national cohort, have shown that actually the rates of sudden cardiac death in children are much lower than previously thought. So they're about 1.2 to 1.5% per year. So much lower than we thought before, but still substantially higher than what we see in adults. So adult sudden death rates in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy are less than 1% per year, about 0.5, 0.6%. What we do know, both in children and in adults, is that pharmacological therapy, antiarrhythmic therapy, does not prevent sudden cardiac death. So there are several studies that have shown that the treatment with amiodarone beta blockers, etc., does not reduce sudden death rates in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And so what we're left with is the ICD, and there are good data to show that ICDs are effective in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So they prevent, or they treat ventricular arrhythmias and prevent sudden cardiac death, but particularly for secondary prevention, but also for primary prevention. But of course, this doesn't come without potential side effects. So these are data from our UK cohort showing actually a very high rate of complications and morbidity associated with ICD implantation. So things like infection, lead complications, etc. And this is sort of beyond the scope of this talk. But as a result of this, over the last few decades, there's been a move towards implanting simpler devices, so single-chamber subcutaneous devices. But I think what these data really highlight, actually, is the importance of being able to accurately identify those children who would benefit the most from ICD implantation, and therefore try to minimize the risk of complications. So in adults, there are pretty well-established algorithms and calculators that can be used to predict sudden cardiac death risk. This is the one that's endorsed by the European Society of Cardiology. But there are some caveats to this, and most importantly, in the pediatric population, this adult model was not developed or validated in children under the age of 16. And even in that sort of 16 to 18-year-old age group, there were very, very small numbers of patients, both in the validation, in the development and in the validation cohorts. And so if we look at the current guidelines as they currently stand, in terms of risk stratification for children with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the European guidelines recommend implanting an ICD to individuals who have 2 or more so-called major risk factors, conventional risk factors, so unexplained syncope, severe left ventricular hypertrophy, family history of sudden cardiac death, non-sustained VT on Holter monitoring. And the North American guidelines, including the most recent ones from 2020, they use a very similar approach, this sort of cumulative risk factor approach. The only difference is that with the American guidelines, you just need 1 risk factor in order to warrant ICD implantation. The problem is that these risk factors are actually not based on pediatric data. They're extrapolated largely from adult data. And until very recently, we were using these approaches, these cumulative risk factor approach, without any evidence as to whether it actually worked or not. And a few years ago, we tried to sort of assessed this in our own population, our own cohort in the United Kingdom, and what we found was that whilst it is true that with increasing numbers of risk factors, the rates of sudden cardiac death are higher, the vast majority of patients who die suddenly with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy actually don't have any risk factors or only have one risk factor. And so the performance of this sort of approach, both the European and the most recent North American approach, is pretty poor. So C statistics of about 0.6, so a little better than random, but really not much more than that. And so as a result of that, a few years ago, we established an international pediatric hypertrophic cardiomyopathy consortium. This was work that was led by Gabby Norrish, who was one of our PhD students at the time, is now one of our clinical lecturers. And this consortium now has data from well over 1,700 patients, more than 45 centers from around the world, so primarily in Europe, but also from further afield. And using this consortium, we were able to develop the first pediatric-specific risk prediction model for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and we published this a couple of years ago. And what this model does is it takes clinical parameters, so parameters that we measure routinely in everyday clinical practice, so maximal wall thickness, importantly as a continuous variable, so not severe or not severe, but the actual value, and also importantly corrected for body size, which is particularly relevant in the pediatric population. But it's maximal wall thickness, left atrial dimensions, unexplained syncope, non-sustained VT, left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. Using these parameters, we were able to develop a model that pretty accurately predicts the risk of a ventricular arrhythmia at 5 years. So the calibration slope is nearly 1. It tells us that what we're observing is similar to what we predict. And the C statistic is about 0.7, which is very similar to the adult model. So it's pretty good at discriminating high risk from low risk. About a year after we published our model, Seema Mittal's group from Toronto published another very similar risk prediction model for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in childhood. And actually, although the models are slightly different, and they used a slightly different approach to risk factor selection, so we used the literature to identify our risk factors, whereas the Toronto model used their own data. Actually, what's striking is that the risk factors that are included in these models are pretty much the same. So there's some sort of measure of LV hypertrophy, there's left atrial size, syncope, non-sustained VT, etc. We don't have age in our model, but actually when we included age in the model, it didn't really improve the performance. And when you look at the sort of performance of both of these models, they're sort of pretty similar, both in terms of the internal validation and the external validation. So the HOCM Risk Kids model, since its publication, has now been validated a couple of times in very small studies. So a study from Poland and a study from Sweden showing that it works, so very similar performance to our own development. And then a couple of years ago, we published an independent large validation, external validation of this model. So this included data from centers that weren't included in the original development cohort and included a large proportion of patients from the SHARE registry. It's an international cardiomyopathy registry. And the performance was good. So the C statistics are just over 0.7. Calibration slope is good, nearly 1. We didn't set out to deliberately choose a threshold above which you should implant an ICD, although we did look at it, and from a statistical point of view, a 5-year risk of 6% or more is the most accurate statistically. But actually, what I really think is that this model, and in fact all prediction models, certainly for cardiomyopathies, should only really be a tool that are used in the process of shared decision-making with a family. And that should include not just the estimated risk, it's very helpful to give families an estimate of what the risk might be, but also take into account individual factors, the patient's own factors, the family's own factors, the size of the patient, the complications and morbidity that may come from a device. So for me, the best use of these models is as a shared decision-making tool rather than as a definite, if your risk is above a certain number, you definitely warrant an ICD. So the American guidelines are slightly different. So the model that I showed you in adults is the model endorsed by the European Society of Cardiology guidelines. The North American guidelines are different. They still use this single risk factor approach, both in children and in adults. And actually, I think it's worthwhile looking at some of the individual risk factors that are quoted here or mentioned here as representing major significant risk factors on the basis of which you can implant an ICD if you have a single one of these. And probably the best studied of these is severe left ventricular hypertrophy. So according to the American guidelines, somebody has extreme LVH, they get an ICD, regardless of their age. We actually looked at this in our consortium, and again, of course, there is an association between the severity of left ventricular hypertrophy and sudden death risk, but this is not a linear association. Actually, what you find is that the severity of left ventricular hypertrophy is intricately linked to other risk factors as well. So those that have severe LVH also have a higher risk of syncope, also have higher left atrial scores. And actually, when you take those into account, LVH on its own loses its predictive capacity. And the other thing that's really interesting is that the curve of the association between LVH and event rate is not a straight line, but it's this sort of inverse U shape. So actually, paradoxically, you get to a stage where patients with very, very severe left ventricular hypertrophy perhaps don't have quite the same risk of sudden cardiac death as those with less severe LVH. So it's interesting to think about things in that way. So just on its own, LVH is probably not a risk factor you'd want to use as a sole determinant of ICD implantation. Another one that's really interesting to look at is left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. So in adults, there are some data to suggest that gradients, high gradients, are associated with sudden cardiac death risk. In our model, we sort of saw the opposite. There was a very weak relationship, inverse relationship between LV outflow tract gradient and sudden cardiac death risk. So does this mean that if you have a gradient, you have a lower risk? Well, I don't think so. But what's interesting is that both the Toronto model and another study, retrospective study of a very selected group of patients with ICDs from the PACES consortium in the States, both suggested the same thing, this sort of inverse relationship between LV outflow tract obstruction and risk. But it doesn't really make sense that if you're 15 and have a high gradient, your risk is low, and then as soon as you turn 16 and use the adult model, your gradient counts as a risk factor for sudden cardiac death. And I suspect that what's happening is that there's a lot of confounding that we haven't taken into account in our models. And these are unpublished data from our own consortium. We're trying to look at this in a bit more detail, but essentially what I think is happening is that because we're taking measures at baseline to determine the risk, we're missing an evolving phenotype. So we're missing patients who are baseline and not obstructive, but during follow-up develop obstruction, and we're not capturing that in our model. And the reason I say I think that's the case is because a number of the patients who are classified as non-obstructive at baseline actually had myectomies during their follow-up. So they must have developed obstruction at some point. So I think there's probably a significant confounder effect from treatment that we need to investigate. But having said all of that, I think actually we do now have a really good model, or at least a couple of good models, to predict risk of sudden cardiac death in children with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and certainly better than what we used to have before with the cumulative risk factor approach. But of course, there are still really important knowledge gaps. So first of all, the models need to be validated in the real world. So both our model and the Toronto primacy model are available online as a website. So if you see a patient with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, you can input their data, you can get an estimate of your 5-year risk, and then by collecting data from around the world, we'll be able to work out whether these models really do what we think they do. Another important factor is that particularly in the pediatric population, we know that the phenotype evolves and changes significantly during childhood. And so actually trying to refine the model by incorporating serial data, longitudinal data, will be really important. That's something we're working on at the moment. I've mentioned some risk factors already. There's probably additional risk factors that when you add them to these models probably improve their performance. We don't know that for a fact yet, but we did, for example, look at the ECG risk score. There was a suggestion that certain features on the ECG might improve, might be useful for risk stratification in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. In our cohort, the addition of the ECG didn't improve the performance of the model. There are interesting data, but very, very small numbers, suggesting that perhaps the addition of late gadolinium enhancement on cardiac MRI might improve the performance of the risk model. Again, very small numbers, and this needs to be validated in larger cohorts. Everything that I've talked about really refers to sarcomeric disease, non-syndromic disease. But we know that although it's much rarer, children with rasopathy syndromes and some inborn errors of metabolism are also at risk of dying suddenly. And so identifying specific risk factors for those populations will also be really important. And finally, although sudden cardiac death is definitely the most important cause of death and most prevalent cause of death during childhood, there are really elegant data from the SHARE registry and from others to show that actually over a course of a lifetime, the thing that causes the most morbidity and mortality actually is heart failure, AF, but primarily heart failure, particularly for individuals diagnosed in childhood. So when we're thinking about risk stratification, we should be thinking not just about sudden cardiac death, but also about disease progression to heart failure in these populations. So I'm going to stop there, but I just want to say thank you very much to all the people who have collaborated in all the work that I've shown you, without whom none of this would have been possible, including, I think, a number of people who might be in the audience as well from some of the centers from France that were very kindly took part in these studies. But thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.